Well, it's pretty clear from watching that video that there's a popular way of viewing God, viewing religion in our world today that a lot of people walk around and sort of spout. But if I could sum up what you just heard in that video, and if I were to use a picture of what that might look like or an illustration for you to understand it, here's the way it might look. It's like this. Picture all of mankind, and we're all standing at the foot of this huge, enormous mountain. And at the top of the mountain is the ultimate goal of life, which most people would agree is God. To get to God, to be with God, to relate to God, to know God, whatever that might sound like to a particular person. But that's the ultimate goal on all of humanity, is to get to the top of that mountain. Now, as we stand at the bottom of the mountain, as we look around, we notice that there are a lot of different roads that lead up that mountain, and they're all different in their own way. Some of them wind up a certain way, and some of them go a little straighter, but some have different scenery, and some have different routes, and they have different distinctives. But at the end of all of the paths, they all reach the same place. They're all going to the top, and we're all going to the top of that mountain. We eventually, if we just pick a path, stay on it, you'll eventually reach the top of the mountain, and you'll eventually find God. It translates out like this. Whether you choose to find God in Buddhism or Hinduism or Islam, Judaism, some other ism or whatever, or Christianity, it really doesn't matter that much at all, because at the heart of all the religions, they're just teaching the same thing. They're just different ways to get to it. They're all man's attempts at trying to reach the top of the mountain. So most people would say, you choose your path and I'll choose my path, and whatever works, works. And they might be a little bit different, but one day it's all going to work out. We'll all find out that we were all doing the same thing, and we'll all end up with God. Now, there's a part of me that wishes that were true. There's a part of me that would say that is so, so attractive. And I think that, but then I always get to the point where I think a little more logically, and I think you probably do too. There's this thing in the world called the law of non-contradiction, and here's what it says. The law of non-contradiction says that if you have two truth claims or more than one truth claim, and they stand side by side, and if they say something that's completely contradictory to one another, well, logically, you know that they can't both be right at the same time. I'll use a very simple illustration. If I were to stand up here on the stage and I were to hold in my hand an apple, and I were to pick two people in the crowd to tell me what this object is, and just imagine one person looked at it and said, well, that's an apple. The other person looked at it and said, no, that's an orange. Well, everybody would know that they both can't be right at the same time. And it wouldn't matter if you had a different perspective. It wouldn't matter if you were even colorblind. It wouldn't matter if you honestly felt like I was holding the orange. The person who says it's an orange, we all know we're smart people. They're just wrong about that. So when two different faith teachings stand side by side, and they have claims about things, about life, about God, and one of them says one thing and the other one is completely contradicting the other one, well, everybody understands that one of them has to be wrong, at least one of them. So if someone tells you there's one God and only one God, and this is who he is, and then another person comes along and says, no, there are actually thousands of gods, it is literally impossible for both of them to be correct. And that's the case with the world of multiple religious teachings. In fact, some of you may remember this if you were around a while back. A few years ago, we invited leaders from every major world religion to be here in our service. We had a Sunday service where we invited them all up on stage, and we all sat down, and we asked them the exact same questions, and we gave them equal time. And we said, just give us your answers to these very basic questions. And we asked questions like, who is God? And what sacred text should you follow? And what's the purpose of life? And what happens when you die? And who is Jesus? And after every one of them had their time and they spoke on all of these different questions, it was no denying. Everybody in the room said, wow, those answers. In fact, some of them couldn't have been more polar opposite, but the answers were always different. In fact, I went backstage. I represented Christianity for us that day, and I spoke on behalf of Jesus. And once it was done, we all went backstage, and just as building conversation with them, and I just wanted to know what their reaction was. I said, what did you guys think about what we did here today? What was your impressions? And every single one of them said something like, wow, we really do have different answers to the same questions. It was obvious to even them. So it's not really a question of whether do the teachings match up and are they the same. I think most intelligent people would say that they don't always teach the same thing. Any reasonable person can see that. The question that you and I have to wrestle with is, which one do I trust? Who is most trustworthy? Which belief system am I going to trust to answer the most vital questions to my life and to this existence that we have? So for us, I thought today to just get at this question, because again, we're trying to deal with some of these big questions that people have about God and about Christianity. I simply want to present to you reasons. I just want to illustrate to you, and we're going to use a visual. We're going to bring it up here on stage, and you'll see how that works out in just a minute. But I'm going to use a visual illustration just to show you why myself and probably many of you in here today have ultimately said, you know what, I believe Christianity. I believe the claims of Jesus Christ, and I want that to be the foundation of my life. And you may say, well, why are you going to slant it toward Christianity? Well, we're a church. That's sort of what we do. And if you've been around here for a while, you've actually seen us do this before. And I want you to get the full thinking behind this before we get into it, because I don't want you to think this is something that it's not. Here's the thinking behind this. In order for you to get a clear idea of whether or not a particular faith system is trustworthy or not, I really think it's important that you look at the particular religious leader who started the whole thing. And the question goes like this, and again, I think this is extremely important. I'll tell you why. It just stands to reason that if there is a God, I mean, we sort of have to start there. If there is a God, doesn't it stand to reason that at some point in human history, God would reveal himself to human beings? Doesn't it make sense that God would want us to know who he is and what he's like? I just think that makes a lot of sense, that if there is a God, he would do that. I also think it makes a lot of sense to say that if God chose to reveal himself to human beings, when he did so, the person he uses to reveal himself, the person he reveals himself through, would make the world notice. It would be a case where that person would cause the world to just sit up, take notice, and it would be sort of a big deal. I don't know, maybe it's just me, but I think that's a conceivable kind of way to look at it. So when you take a look at the religious leaders that have come on the scene throughout history, who have sort of come along and said, well, here's the way to God, and here's how you ought to think about him, and if you take all of them and you just sort of view them objectively, you kind of have to admit, some of them start to rise to the top. Some of them start to become a little more significant than the others, and when it really get down to it, there are about 4 that rise to the top. So we pulled together research and did some digging on this whole thing, and we looked at the 4 top leaders. And I just tell you, we want to do this as objectively as I can possibly do it. We're going to use a visual illustration and stack them up beside one another and see how they stack together. Now, before I do this, I just want you to know this is not something where we're going to try and bash other people's beliefs, or we're not trying to disparage another religious leader. We want to do this with gentleness. I want to do this with much respect as I know how. And I want to just strictly dwell in the area of verifiable evidence, stuff that any of us could go and look up in history and verify for ourselves. This is not going to be any kind of speculative kind of thing. It's just what's been reported throughout history. These 4 religious leaders, you just need to know, I believe they're all extraordinary men. I believe they have done some amazing things for humanity throughout history. I don't disparage them at all. But at the end of this, I hope, like me, when you just look at some facts, you'll just start to try and figure it out, make a logical choice as to which one of these leaders is the most worthy to be followed, that can be trusted, and you can really ask the most important questions of life. So let's start with identifying them. Who are the big major players in the religious world? Well, let's start with the 4 that have had the greatest influence, and we'll start with Confucius, and we'll bring out a box, and we'll set it across the stage, and we'll use each of these stacks to represent each leader. You may not have heard much from Confucius lately, but he easily makes this list. Confucius lived about 551 BC, and at one time in history, he had influence over 300 million people. Now, just for perspective, that's roughly how many people live in the United States. Now, that number has dropped significantly. His teachings were actually banned in China after the revolution of 1949, but you don't care about that. But to have that many people at one time follow your teaching makes you a pretty significant leader. So we're going to start with him and put him on the list. The second one is Buddha. Just for fun, anybody ever know what this guy's name really was? Because that wasn't his name. Buddha's actual name was Siddhartha Gautama, which I would have changed my name too. God help him. But most people think that that's his name. It's not his name. It's actually a title that was given to him. Buddha actually means enlightened one. And he lived around the same time Confucius did, about 563 BC. And as far as his influence on the world, hundreds of millions of people throughout the parts of Asia that he was in began to follow his teaching. And today, best estimates, roughly 382 million people follow him. So he's definitely a major player. Next, Muhammad. Now, most of you already know that Muhammad is the founder and the prophet of the religion of Islam. He was born about 1,000 years after Buddha and Confucius. And today, Islam, you just need to know, is a rapidly growing religion. Has about 1.3 billion followers. That's billion with a B. So that would easily make the religion that Muhammad started the second largest in the world today. Finally, we come to Jesus of Nazareth, of course. Now, just curious on this. Anybody know what year he was born? That's a trick question. Don't answer that. I'm sorry. I couldn't resist. No, I bring that up to make this point, and I think I've talked to you guys about this a while back. Every calendar on our planet is set and divided by the birth of Jesus Christ. I mean, BC. I mean, we've already done it. BC and AD. It's the dividing line of history when Jesus was born. So, right now, about 2.1 billion people follow his teachings. That's about twice the number of Muslims. And again, these are the four major religious leaders in our world. Now, some of you who are, in tune to this kind of thing might be saying, well, where's Hinduism represented in this? And you're right. That's not up there. And the reason is because Hinduism doesn't really have an identified leader. In fact, they don't even have a clear defined God. I mean, there's no one clear definable God in Hinduism. And it's not that I wanted to leave it out. It's that for the comparison that we're doing today in my talk, it just really didn't fit. So it's more of a philosophy than it is led by a religious leader. So, but you're going to see it actually plays into specifically one of these guys in just a minute. So as objectively and as fairly as we can do it, we're going to look at specific categories of what you might expect religious leaders to major in and just sort of see, are they all equal or is there some kind of distinction here? And the first category that I think you have to look at is how impactful have their teachings been? Now, Confucius was known in his day as the sagest of the sages. In other words, that means he's about as smart as they come. Very intelligent man. But you might find this interesting. Confucius never claimed to write original material. In fact, he didn't write a whole lot of original stuff. By his own admission, he mainly collected sayings of other wise people, and he collected them together in a book called the Analects. Now, and here's another interesting thing. Confucius was not very concerned about how people connect with God. He wasn't very concerned about that. His main goal of his time, he wanted to help people walk in wisdom. He wanted to help people get along better. He wanted people to be peaceful to one another, which, who can argue with that? I mean, all great, great things. He just wasn't that interested with connecting people with God, per se. And as I said before, at his peak, he reached about 300 million people. Today, it's actually down to about 6 million, but still, we have to give him just a block, a small-sized block, because of the comparison of his teaching. And I think you'll see as we move along how this all compares out. So we'll start with that size of a block for Confucius. Now, like Confucius, Buddha didn't teach original material. I don't know if you knew that, but he borrowed a lot of his teachings from the Hindu philosophy. He talked about things like reincarnation and karma and meditation and so forth, things that, are somewhat popular in our day-to-day. He has some very famous teachings known as the Four Noble Truths, the Eightfold Path. You can look those up. And his teaching basically had to do with eliminating desire. His theory was that if we could release our attachments from this life, if we could rid ourselves of need or rid ourselves of all the desires that we currently have that sort of fight within us, then we would all reach this preferred state. And he called that state nirvana, not the 90s grunge band, but wouldn't that be awesome? Anyway, But that's where that whole term came from. But his teachings are really more widespread than even Confucius. They're accepted all around the world by lots of folks. So we're going to give him a bigger block. We're going to compare him to Confucius, give him a little bit larger chunk there. All right. Muhammad. If you look at Muhammad's teaching, you can summarize his teachings in really 5 statements. Number 1, Allah is the one true God. Number 2, Allah has many prophets, including Jesus, by the way, including Moses, but Muhammad's the greatest, and he's the last prophet. Number 3, the Quran is the supreme religious book of the world. Number 4, there are different beings between us and God, and some are good and some are evil. Number 5, someday everyone's deeds are going to be weighed, and God is going to see, Allah will see whether you have done enough good or enough bad, and he will decide whether or not you deserve what they would call paradise, which is their version of the afterlife. So in Islam, salvation is based totally on what you do or what you don't do. And all of these teachings, as you know, can be found in the book, the Quran, which is widely read and distributed all over the world. So to be fair, Muhammad has to have a larger block. So we'll give him a larger block than the other 2. All right, now we come to Jesus. And if you strictly want to talk about the impact that Jesus' teaching has had, it really overshadows the other if you're objective about it. I mean, whenever a poll is done anywhere in the world, no matter where you're at, and ask people who is the greatest teacher, Jesus will be the top of the list or he'll be near the top of the list. Jesus' words, this is just true, Jesus' words have been quoted more often than any other teacher. His stories have been repeated more than any other. 94% of the world has some form of the Bible in their own language. Even in a bad year, the Bible sells 60 to 70 million copies. And that's ongoing. It's not just a one-time thing. It will happen this year, it will happen next year, and the year after. It's been that way for generations. So if you're just totally objective when it comes to the impact of Jesus' teaching, he has to get the largest, okay, because of the impact of his teaching on the world. So we'll put that up there. Now, I want to move into another topic or another category, and I'll admit before I get there, it's a little more controversial, but I think it's important when you want to be honest. What about personal morality? Because, I mean, if all of these men taught great things, we need to kind of look at their lives and see how well they did at living them out. So let's talk about Confucius. Well, Confucius was a great man. There was nothing, actually. You can't really find anything bad written about the guy. But at the same time, Confucius never claimed to be morally spotless. He never put that on. Nobody ever really said that about him. In fact, from what we do know about him, he would be a normal guy. He would be a very average, morally speaking, he'd be very average. So to make him not stand out above the rest, but to not disparage him, we're going to give him about a half a block just to be average. Okay, so let's bring that out there. Let's put that up. Now, looking at Buddha, same kind of thing. He was a very strong proponent of living morally. I mean, and if you read what people said about him, he did about all that he could do to live out what he taught. I mean, he really tried to follow the Eightfold Path that he taught. He was very devout. And so, to be fair, I would put him above average. And so, let's put a little bit larger block out there for him, just as a comparison. Now, once you get to Muhammad, it's a little bit stickier because Muhammad actually admits to lots of transgressions. In fact, just to list a few, he admits to killing several people in conflicts. At one point, which I would consider this not a very moral thing to do, there was a limit to the number of wives that you could have in the Muslim religion, and the limit was 4. And at one time, Muhammad claimed that he got a special revelation from God that would allow him to have more than 4 wives. Incidentally, he did not extend that courtesy to anybody else in the religion. But there's also accounts of Muhammad from his very own followers talking about how he had a dark side, and they saw that come out many different times. He repeatedly asked Allah for forgiveness. He admitted that he was a very flawed human being. And again, this is not bashing anybody. This is just verifiable evidence, and I don't need to go into any other detail. But to be fair and to be honest, he has to have a smaller block than the rest of the guys because of his own conduct. Now, what about Jesus? Well, when I think about this topic, you realize that one of the best tests of someone's personal morality is to talk to their enemies. I mean, if you have an enemy and someone asks them about you and they get a chance to bash you, they take it every time. I mean, that's just the way it is. I mean, so what did Jesus' enemies have to say about him? We just need to know. One time Jesus stood in front of his enemies and he was talking to them, and he was so open, he was so unashamed of his moral character that he literally asked them, he said, find something wrong. Test me. Find something wrong with me if you can. And you know what happened? His enemies couldn't say anything. They didn't say a word against him. In fact, many times they tried to bring charges against him, and it was always difficult to do. They couldn't really make anything stick. And you can look all throughout recorded history, and you won't find a negative word about Jesus' character. He lived 33 years on this planet, and not one record of a harsh word or an exaggeration or an act of revenge or a lie or even an oversight. And on the flip side of that, on the more positive side of that, people now, even today, they look to Jesus as the standard setter when it comes to morality. I mean, that's sort of to a person. I mean, everybody, no one could compete with Jesus when you look at an example of compassion, when you look at examples of love for the outcast or generosity or encouragement or his acceptance of people who weren't like him, his acceptance of people who were far from God or whatever. I mean, no one compares to Jesus. Now, think of it this way, and this is an illustration that works for me because I'm a big baseball fan, but if a baseball player in Major League Baseball gets a hit 4 out of every 10 times, they have a batting average of 400, right? You realize that that's like unheard of these days. I mean, the guy who won the batting title this year was, 330 something at his peak. We put guys who hit 400 in the Hall of Fame instantly. And you wouldn't even conceive of a person who played baseball and didn't at least have 1 or 2 errors out in the field. My point is this: moral perfection is harder than baseball. And from all accounts, even from his enemies, Jesus achieved it. So again, and I know I'm biased, but to try and be as fair as I can, I have to say you got to give him a double block for personal morality, because that's hard to do. I mean, nobody even comes close on this one, and nobody even really claims to. So let's look at another category, and this time I want to look at the power to do miracles. And here's the way this thinking goes. How many of these spiritual leaders possess the power to connect with the supernatural and make it real in this world? Because if a leader is going to come on the scene and claim to have supernatural truth, to be specially connected to God somehow, I think it's fair to look at that. So when you look at it fairly, how did Confucius do on that? I mean, well, the truth is he never claimed it. He never once claimed that he had miracle working power. In fact, his followers even claimed he never worked any miracles and never tried to. Buddha, same thing. No one ever claimed it, neither did he. Do you know that even the Quran makes it crystal clear that Muhammad had no miracle working power at all? So what about Jesus? You just need to know that even historians who write outside the Bible, these are not even biblical writers, but people who wrote outside of the Bible, note the fact, and they don't really question the fact that Jesus was able to perform supernatural miracles. And it's widely reported that Jesus did all kinds of miraculous things, and not just these hidden kinds of miracles. He did miracles in front of people with witnesses. They saw it happen, and these witnesses reported the amazing things they saw. It began to spread. You need to know, the miracles that Jesus did were not these silly nonsense things that you see on television. They weren't hidden. They're not about curing bad backs or a sore knee and knocking somebody over, and you don't see the miracle, but you just have to believe it. Jesus' miracles were not hidden. They were totally visible. One time, Jesus fed thousands of people with a single lunchbox, and people watched him do it. They ate the food that he gave them. Jesus calmed storms. He cured leprosy, which is a physical, visible disease. He gave sight to the blind. He made lame people get up and walk, all in front of witnesses, all that people saw. One time Jesus raised a guy up who had been in a tomb for 3 days. That ain't easy, folks. Now, you have to admit, in this category, Jesus doesn't just exceed the others. He is in a completely different category, because not even one of these other leaders even claimed the kinds of things that people say they saw and experienced Jesus doing. So again, we have to at least give him another full block in that category. So let's look at another category. How about the ability to prophesy? You know? In other words, that special supernatural ability to see into the hearts and the motives of people, to have special knowledge about certain people, certain events, certain places, seeing into the future, knowing what's coming, to predict the future, to make judgment calls on things like that. Again, if you look objectively just at the historical record, there is absolutely no mention of this coming from Confucius, no mention of it coming from Buddha. To be fair, you will find in the historical record a few times when Muhammad made some predictions. He would make a prediction about how well his troops were going to do in battle, and at times he was correct. But it wouldn't rise to the category of what we're talking about here today. Again, what about Jesus? Jesus displayed prophetic power unlike the world had ever seen. I mean, Jesus could actually look into the hearts and the motivations of human beings. He astounded people. There were many times Jesus showed that he knew things about people that no one could have known without some kind of supernatural ability. For instance, one time Jesus was having a conversation with a woman. He's sitting by a well, and she comes to draw water from this well. And they have this conversation, and during the conversation, she just mentions to Jesus that she's single. And then Jesus goes on to say, actually, I knew that about you. And he kind of playfully shoots back, and he says, I know that about you. And not only that, I know that you've had 5 previous husbands, and currently you have a live-in lover. Now, you would think when Jesus does that it would cause her to be offended and it would cause her to feel condemned. Incidentally, she felt the opposite. Jesus reveals her checkered past and what he knows about her and her current reputation, and the woman never feels condemned. She never feels threatened. He offers her grace. He offers her understanding. And she's so blown away by this encounter with him that she says, not only are you a prophet, you're in a whole other category of prophets. I don't know what to think about you. Something special is about you. And that day, her life, and actually the lives of pretty much everybody in her village, was changed. They believed in Jesus because of that encounter. Jesus foretold his own death. He told people exactly what it was going to be like, how it was going to happen, and it happened just like he predicted. One of his most astounding ones was he was in a crowd one time, and he predicted the fall of the city of Jerusalem. In fact, at the time he said it was unthinkable. It was unheard of. I mean, it was something that people just couldn't even believe. In fact, it got him in a lot of trouble. He had a lot of scrutiny over that prediction. 4 decades after Jesus died, you realize that Jerusalem fell, and it happened precisely the way Jesus said it would. Now, the list could go on and on and on, but my point is, Jesus again stands head and shoulders above all the other religious leaders when it comes to just prophesying, to know this kind of stuff. So again, we're just going to give him another block just to recognize that. One last category, and then we'll be done. And this has to do with the ability to overcome death and the grave. Now, to be fair, here's my thinking on this one. You realize, it's going to take a little more. But you do realize that for centuries now, religious leaders have come on the scene. And each time they do, they claim to have some sort of special connection or special supernatural connection with God. In other words, these messiahs, as they are known, sort of claim to be different. In other words, they're not like you. They're not like me. They have some sort of special kind of abilities or some sort of special connection to God. And there's something that happens every single time they come on the scene when they say they're in this special supernatural kind of category that always is a problem. One thing often calls their bluff, pulls back the curtain, and proves to their followers that their claims may not have been everything that they said they were. They all die. And not only do they all die, they stay dead. And you realize that every time that happens, when a Messiah comes on the scene and says, I'm different, and then they die, and then they stay dead, their followers come back together after it's over, and they all ask themselves the same question. Do you think he was just like us? Do you think that maybe he's going to stay in that grave and he doesn't have the key to life like maybe he said he did? And every time it happens, their followers become hurt. They become confused. They become disillusioned. And they discover that their Messiah might possibly not be as supernatural as they thought he was, because maybe he was a regular guy. An example of this in our day, if you remember your recent history, a guy named David Koresh in Waco, Texas, claimed to be the Messiah. He claimed that he was going to lead people into this end of the civilization as we know it, and there was going to be this great battle, and he was going to win, and we're going to live forever, or all that stuff. And if you know your history, you remember witnessing it. We watched on the news as he and many of his followers burned up in that compound, and it was horrible. But after it was over, his remaining followers, they got together and they said, maybe he was wrong. Maybe he wasn't what he claimed to be. And I just say, sadly, that scene happens over and over throughout history. It happened with Confucius's followers. It happened with Buddha's followers. And it happened with Muhammad's followers. And to this day, the followers of all of these men and all other religious movements visit graves. They visit tombs. And in those visits, they commemorate a leader who is still in the grave. But those who follow Jesus, they also visit a tomb. You can go see it. It's just outside the city of Jerusalem today. But when you go there, if you're a follower of Christ, you go there for a completely different reason. You go to stand in awe and amazement at the fact that your leader is no longer in that tomb. That 3 days after his death, Jesus walked out of that tomb. And for a period of about 50 days, he showed himself in very public places. One time he showed up and showed himself to about 500 people all at one time. They all reported seeing him. He had talks with his friends. He ate meals with people. He shared meals. These witnesses saw him with their own eyes. They heard him speak. They touched him. They felt the scars on his hands. They watched him ascend into heaven. And listen, you may be sitting there with a lot of doubts, and you've got questions about all this, and you're wondering, is that really authentic, and how do you know? And listen, I would just challenge you, head to the bookstore. Start some research on this. The evidence of the resurrection of Jesus Christ is astounding. No other leader in all of history has ever made such a claim, and no other leader has evidence to back it up. So when you compare this, when you're comparing this to all the other leaders, the question begs itself, what do you give a guy for a resurrection? How many boxes does that take? I don't know. Let's do 2. I don't know. You know, that's the best. We don't have any more ladders. So now, while John's finishing the project and giving you a visual to see up there, I just want to make a few last comments on this whole thing as you're sort of taking this all in. And I want to I want to be serious about this. When you start to look at a comparison like that, there are a couple of things that I hope you see and I hope you think. First, I hope you understand that, again, and I feel like I have to keep saying this because I want you to hear this, we don't do this to put anybody down. We didn't do this to disparage anybody's beliefs or their leader. It is not meant to be a judgment or a condemnation of them. This is just a look at history and the facts that have been put out there as objectively as I know how. And I hope you get that. But the second thing is if you're a follower of Jesus, if you're his follower, and I am, many of you in this room are, I know. I hope that you'll take a fresh look at the one you follow. And like me, I hope you'll say in your heart, boy, there's a reason he's my Savior. There's a reason that I follow this guy. There's a reason that I've given my life to him. There's good reasons. And I hope that you'll say the same thing in your heart that I've been saying this whole time. Every time I prepare for this kind of a talk, I think to myself, man, I'm so glad I follow him. I'm so glad. But I also want to speak directly to those of you who are still skeptical, and you're not a follower of Jesus. Maybe you're here because this topic was interesting sounding and a friend invited you and you wanted to see, wow, I wonder what a church is going to say about that and wonder how they're going to mess that up. I get that, okay? And I want you to know this. I am not so naive to think that 30-minute talk and a stack of boxes is going to change your mind. I'm not that stupid. I get it. But you have to admit one thing. There's a difference. There's a real difference. And I hope that at the end of the day, at least I've caused you to take a second look at Jesus. That's all I'm saying. Because no other person who has ever lived has had a more profound impact on the human race than him. And listen, if you're convinced that he's not the Son of God and that none of this stuff happened, if you're just convinced that it's not true, then, okay, write him off. Write him off. But he has to be a phony or a fraud or a lunatic. He leaves you with no other options. He's not a good man if this is not true. And before you write him off, at least give him a chance. Look into it. Look into the evidence. You at least owe it to yourself to know what you don't believe. Because if he was right, and if he really is God in the flesh, if he really did live a sinless life, if he really did die on that cross to pay the penalty for your sin, and if he really did rise from that grave, it changes everything. It changes everything. And I'll say this again. We said it right at the beginning of the service. We didn't want to cram this down your throat. That was not our intention. We're just offering you some thoughts. We want to start a conversation. And here's the truth. Those of us who follow Jesus, we've just discovered the most amazing story the world has ever heard. That's all. And we'd love it if you discovered it too. That's all. We just want you to know a God who loves you. A God who came for you. A God who doesn't expect you to be good to get on his good side. A God who said everything that needs to be done for you and I to be right is already done. Through Jesus, through his death, through his resurrection. And now God who loves you, he wants to give you life. Not just now, but for all of eternity. And the best part is, it's free. It's a gift. He just loves you so much. And we want to help. If you're in the middle of that journey, we want to help you. We want to be a part of that. We want to answer questions. We want to struggle with you. We don't want to put you down. We want to be a help to you. So my challenge is, if that's where you are, ask us. We want to be a part of that. You can ask me. You can ask somebody here on our staff, any of your campus pastors here. The friend who invited you would love nothing more than to be a part of that journey as well. And we'll do whatever we can to serve you. Let's bow for prayer. God, as I stand here today, I'm just always awed and humbled to know that you have revealed yourself to me, and that through Christ you have given me a free gift of salvation and relationship with you. God, I pray for people who are still struggling with that question, who may still wonder and still have questions that are unanswered. God, would you just be real to them in these next coming days and weeks? Would you just be a part of that journey? Draw them to yourself. And use us, the church, use their friends around them to help them. And as we walk together, God, may we all just take next steps toward love and faith toward you. In Jesus' name, amen. See you next week.